What does a human being bring back from space besides data, dust, and photographs? For 60 years, that question has followed astronauts home like a second shadow. They return to Earth with their checklists completed, their missions recorded, their voices folded into history. And yet, around some of those journeys, there lingers a different kind of silence. Not the silence of empty space, but the silence that forms when an experience resists language, or when language itself is carefully contained. We like to imagine space as a realm of clean facts, trajectories, timelines, instrument readings. But every frontier in human history has also been a mirror. It reflects our certainty back to us, then asks whether certainty was ever enough. Above the atmosphere, where sunrise can happen 16 times in a day, and the Earth glows like a living memory, even trained observers can encounter moments that seem to stretch beyond the edges of explanation. Some stories begin with a flash outside a window, others with a radio transmission cut short, a photograph missing from an archive, a debriefing that lasts longer than anyone expected. Across decades and across rival nations, there are accounts that do not fit neatly into the official script. American astronauts, Soviet cosmonauts, engineers, pilots, commanders, scientists, different languages, different ideologies. Yet again and again, the same pattern seems to emerge. An unexpected sight, a private report, and then a door quietly closing. This is not a story about easy answers. It is a story about the fragile boundary between discovery and doubt, and about the people asked to stand at that boundary on behalf of all of us. What did they see? What did they think they saw? And why do some memories seem to grow heavier with time instead of fading? Perhaps the deeper mystery is not what waits in space, but how human beings carry the unknown once they have looked directly at it. What does silence sound like at 17,000 miles an hour? In 1963, as Faith 7 circled the planet on the final orbit of Gordon Cooper's Mercury mission, the capsule moved through darkness like a small lantern above a sleeping world. Below him, oceans held their weather and continents kept their borders. Up there, borders meant very little. There was only motion, instrument light, and the disciplined breathing of a pilot trained never to romanticize what he saw. Then something appeared. Cooper later described a greenish glow approaching the capsule and holding pace beside him, not drifting like debris, not flashing like a distant star, but moving with a steadiness that suggested intention. For a few moments, the object seemed to accompany him, as if space itself had decided to look back. Ground stations reportedly tracked it as well. In the language of aviation, that should have meant a record, a report, a place in the transcript. In the language of institutions, it may have meant something else entirely. Cooper was not a man easily dismissed. He was one of the original Mercury astronauts, a military test pilot shaped by procedure, precision, and risk. Men like that were chosen because they could separate fear from fact. Yet when he returned, the story around the sighting grew thin, formal, almost evasive. Publicly, the mission remained a triumph of engineering. Privately, another lesson may have settled in. Not every observation was meant for open conversation. Years later, Cooper would speak more freely, as older men sometimes do when time removes the need to please authority. He suggested that unusual encounters were not rare, and that silence had become part of the culture surrounding them. Whether one accepts his interpretation or not, the deeper question lingers. When a credible witness is asked to doubt his own memory for the sake of order, what exactly is being protected? National security, scientific caution, or our fragile idea of how the universe is supposed to behave? What if the strangest moments in space were not the ones recorded in mission logs, but the ones preserved in the nervous glance between colleagues? In the Soviet program, where secrecy was not merely policy but atmosphere, stories often survived only in fragments. A remark passed quietly, a memoir softened by censorship, a recollection shared years later, when the country that demanded silence had already vanished. In that world, mystery did not arrive dramatically. It accumulated in the margins. One of the most haunting accounts circles around Vladimir Kovalyonok, commander of the Salyut 6 station in 1981. He reportedly observed an object outside the station unlike anything he expected to see in orbit. According to later descriptions, it resembled a brilliant formation that shifted shape before his eyes, as if two physical realities had briefly overlapped. It was not simply a light in the distance. It was something near enough, strange enough, to disturb the calm language astronauts depended on to stay rational. Inside a space station, routine is a form of survival. Every sound has meaning. Every flicker can become a threat. To witness something that does not fit the known vocabulary of mechanics or meteorology is to feel the mind searching for handholds. Is it equipment, reflection, fatigue, a trick of solar glare? The first duty is not wonder but control. The witness must master the event even while the event resists being mastered. And yet, control has limits. The Soviet system prized heroes, but only the kind that confirmed the system's confidence. Ambiguity was unwelcome. A cosmonaut could speak of courage, sacrifice, and technical excellence. To speak too openly of an inexplicable sight was to risk sounding undisciplined, even disloyal to the order that sent him there. So the account remained suspended between testimony and caution. Perhaps it was a misperception shaped by stress and light. Perhaps it was something more unusual, something no manual had prepared him to name. Either way, the episode reveals a larger truth. The unknown does not become less real because institutions prefer certainty. Sometimes it simply retreats into private memory, where it waits, patient, unresolved, and strangely alive. Can a photograph carry more uncertainty than a spoken story? In 1965, during the Gemini 4 mission, James McDivitt looked out into the vast brightness beyond his capsule and saw something he could not easily classify. Against the deep black of orbit, an object appeared with a shape that seemed structured rather than random, distinct enough to arrest the attention of a pilot trained to notice the smallest irregularity. For a moment, it was not a rumor or a second-hand recollection. It was simply there. McDivitt tried to do what any disciplined observer would do. He reached for his camera. The act itself feels almost symbolic now, a human impulse to hold on to the uncertain before it dissolves. But space is rarely cooperative. Distances deceive. Motion compresses time. By the time an image is taken, the thing being witnessed may already have changed meaning. A photograph can freeze light, but it cannot always preserve context. It can show a shape without explaining it, a blur without its velocity, a form without its scale. Back on Earth, the images and descriptions were examined, debated, and folded into the larger machinery of official interpretation. Some suggested a piece of spacecraft hardware, detached and drifting. Others believed the account pointed to something less ordinary. McDivitt himself remained measured, neither turning the incident into spectacle nor pretending certainty where he did not have it. That restraint may be what makes the moment endure. He did not ask the world to believe in a fantasy. He merely insisted on the integrity of what he experienced. There is something deeply human in that position. We tend to think truth becomes stronger once it is photographed, documented, archived, but sometimes the opposite happens. The closer an ambiguous image comes to evidence, the more fiercely it is argued over, until the image itself becomes a screen for our assumptions. Perhaps this is why certain photographs feel haunted. They do not prove enough to close the question. They only deepen it, and in that deepening, they remind us that seeing has never been the same as understanding. What happens when the mystery is not outside the spacecraft, but inside the human mind itself? During long missions, astronauts and cosmonauts have sometimes described moments that seem to hover between perception and vision, experience and dream. They are not always presented as encounters in the ordinary sense. Sometimes they arrive as vivid images, impossible scenes, or overwhelming impressions that feel more real than memory. In orbit, where the body is displaced from every habit it evolved to trust, consciousness can become its own frontier. Several Soviet cosmonauts spoke, cautiously and at different times, of unusual psychological episodes during extended stays in space. Reports surfaced of profound dreamlike states, of sensing other lives, other eras, even other forms of being with an immediacy that defied explanation. These accounts were never easy to categorize. They did not belong neatly to engineering or medicine, yet neither were they simple fantasies that could be dismissed without thought. They suggested that spaceflight might alter not only the body, but the structure of inner experience. To modern ears, such stories invite two equal temptations. One is to make them mystical, to treat them as proof that space opens hidden doors in the universe. The other is to flatten them into pathology, to explain them away as fatigue, stress, isolation, or neurochemical strain. Both responses may be too quick. Human experience has always included moments that do not fit easily into the available language. The fact that they occur in orbit only sharpens the question. Imagine circling the Earth in darkness, cut off from weather, trees, crowds, and ordinary gravity. Imagine the strange intimacy of seeing the whole planet at once and belonging physically to none of it. Under such conditions, perhaps the mind does not malfunction so much as reveal its own depth. Perhaps it begins to speak in symbols because plain speech is no longer enough. If that is true, then some of the most unsettling things reported in space may not be evidence of what surrounds us, but of what lies dormant within us, waiting for distance, silence, and solitude to bring it to light. What if the most revealing testimony comes from someone who spent a lifetime defending caution? Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut who walked on the moon in 1971, did not speak like a man eager to be swept away by fantasy. He had a doctorate, a pilot's discipline, and the hard-earned credibility of someone who had traveled farther than almost anyone alive. Yet in the years after his mission, Mitchell became one of the most discussed voices in the conversation about unexplained phenomena and the possibility that governments knew more than they admitted. Mitchell's importance was not that he claimed to have seen a spaceship through a lunar window. He did not build his public reflections around a single sensational event. Instead, his story was quieter and in some ways more unsettling. He suggested that during his years in and around the space program, he encountered insiders, military figures, and intelligence-connected sources who believed unusual encounters had been studied and carefully managed behind closed doors. He spoke not as a witness to one decisive moment, but as a man convinced that a pattern existed beyond public view. That distinction matters. A direct sighting can be challenged as error, stress, or misinterpretation. But when a respected astronaut begins to question the boundaries of official knowledge, the issue shifts. It becomes less about one object in the sky and more about the architecture of trust. How much do citizens really know about the institutions that act in their name? And how much uncertainty can those institutions tolerate before they choose silence over complexity? Critics argued that Mitchell had moved too far from the strict culture of evidence that once defined him. Admirers believed he had simply grown more willing to follow questions wherever they led. Perhaps both views contain some truth. Age can loosen the grip of caution, but it can also deepen a person's patience with ambiguity. In the end, Mitchell's legacy in this story is not certainty. It is permission. The permission to ask whether the bravest form of inquiry is not always looking outward, but also examining the stories power tells about what may or may not be real. Why do some of the most persistent mysteries begin as ordinary procedures? During the Apollo era, thousands of photographs were taken for reasons that had nothing to do with wonder. They documented terrain, equipment, maneuvering, geology, and survival. They were tools before they were symbols. Yet among those images, certain frames seemed to invite a second life. A bright form near the horizon, a distant reflection, a shape that looked too organized to be accidental. Once such images entered public circulation, they no longer belonged only to science. They belonged to interpretation. Around the moon, perception becomes a fragile instrument. Light arrives without atmosphere to soften it. Shadows harden into absolute black. Distances become treacherous. A ridge may seem close enough to reach, while an object can appear solid when it is only glare caught at the wrong angle. Under those conditions, even the most careful photograph can mislead. What looks like a structure may be a trick of contrast. What seems to hover may be dust, lens flare, or the geometry of perspective itself. And yet the fascination endures because the human eye is not only searching for error, it is searching for meaning. When viewers study old mission images and insist they see more than rock and shadow, they are participating in a much older habit, the desire to find pattern at the edge of the known. Some of those claims collapse under scrutiny. Others survive as unresolved possibilities, not because they prove something extraordinary, but because they resist complete dismissal. For the astronauts and engineers, this created a difficult tension. Their work demanded rigor. Public imagination demanded symbols. Somewhere between those forces, the image became unstable, not false, not definitive, but open. An ambiguous photograph can outlive a clear explanation simply because ambiguity invites ownership. Everyone sees it through the lens of what they fear, what they hope, or what they already believe. Perhaps that is why these lunar images still feel strangely alive. They do not just show us the moon, they show us ourselves peering into grain and shadow, asking whether the universe is hiding something from us, or whether we are the ones bringing the secret with us when we look. What if the real story was never the object itself, but the room where people decided how to describe it? Every space program has its public face: launch towers, mission patches, smiling crews under bright lights. But behind that face lies another world, quieter and less photogenic. Debriefing rooms, secure calls, technical reviews, the ordinary machinery through which strange experiences are translated into acceptable language. It is in those spaces, perhaps more than in orbit, that mystery begins to change shape. An astronaut returns from flight carrying two burdens at once. One is physical, exhaustion, re-entry, the body remembering gravity. The other is interpretive. He has seen something unusual, or thinks he has, and now must place it into a system that rewards clarity. If the event can be folded into known categories, it survives. If not, it risks becoming noise. Reflection, instrument artifact, misjudged distance. The vocabulary of caution is often reasonable. It is also powerful. Once applied, it can soften an event until even the witness begins to question himself. This does not require conspiracy in the theatrical sense. Institutions do not need secret cabals to produce silence. They need incentives, national prestige, scientific discipline, fear of ridicule, a chain of command that prefers solvable problems to open-ended ones. In such an environment, the unknown is not necessarily buried because it is explosive. Sometimes it is buried because it is inconvenient. It interrupts the smooth story progress depends on. And so a pattern can emerge without a master plan. Reports become narrower as they move upward. Language grows more cautious with each retelling. What began as astonishment ends as ambiguity, then finally as a footnote. The public sees composure. The witness carries the residue. That may be the most familiar human drama in this entire history. Not that extraordinary things were hidden in vaults, but that experience itself was disciplined until it fit the needs of the moment. We do this in families, in governments, in science, in memory. We name what we can, we file what we cannot, and sometimes, years later, we wonder what was lost in the translation. Why do certain stories survive even when evidence remains incomplete? Because sometimes a mystery endures not through proof, but through repetition, through the way it passes from one careful witness into another, gathering weight without ever becoming fully solid. In the history of spaceflight, there are accounts that seem to echo across decades. Luminous shapes pacing capsules, objects changing direction too cleanly, moments when train crews found themselves confronting something that did not behave like debris, weather, or machinery. No single report closes the case. Together, they form a quiet pattern. Patterns are dangerous things. The mind is built to detect them, sometimes wisely, sometimes too eagerly. We find constellations and scattered stars in meaning and coincidence. Skeptics remind us of this for good reason. Similar stories do not automatically point to a hidden truth. They may reveal shared conditions instead, the same optical distortions, the same stressors, the same habits of perception carried by pilots and engineers into an unfamiliar environment. To compare accounts is not to confirm them. It is only to notice that the unknown appears to have a recurring shape. And yet, repetition changes the emotional texture of doubt. A single witness can be dismissed as mistaken. A second introduces caution. A tenth suggests that something, whether external, psychological, or institutional, is happening often enough to deserve a better language. The question then becomes more subtle. Not, did every astronaut see the same impossible thing? But why do human beings placed in this exact frontier keep returning with experiences that strain the official vocabulary available to them? Perhaps the answer lies partly in space itself. Orbit strips life to essentials: light and shadow, motion and isolation, survival and observation. In such conditions, the familiar world loosens its grip. People may begin to notice things they would overlook on Earth, or attach significance to events that would vanish into ordinary noise below. But even that explanation leaves us with a deeper puzzle. Why does the frontier so reliably produce stories that sound less like technical anomalies and more like encounters with the limits of certainty? Maybe because every frontier is also a test of language. It asks whether our words are large enough for what we have begun to see, and when they are not, the story does not disappear. It returns in fragments, waiting for another witness, another era, another listener willing to sit with uncertainty a little longer. What if the clearest thing space teaches us is how uncertain human memory can become under extraordinary conditions? Long after the missions ended, many astronauts and cosmonauts were asked to revisit moments that had never fully settled in their minds. By then, years had passed, nations had changed, archives had opened unevenly, public fascination had grown, and memory, that delicate instrument, had been working all along, shaping, protecting, revising. This is not a flaw in the story. It may be the story's most human element. Memory does not behave like a camera. It edits by emotion, by meaning, by the need to make experience livable. A brief light outside a spacecraft may become sharper over time if it carried fear, wonder, or the sense of being alone before something immense. Just as easily, details may soften. Sequence may blur. The witness may remember the feeling more clearly than the event itself. That makes these accounts difficult, but not empty. We often assume that uncertainty weakens testimony. Sometimes it does, but sometimes uncertainty is the mark of an honest witness, someone resisting the temptation to turn an incomplete experience into a polished myth. Several astronauts spoke in precisely this register. Careful, measured, unwilling to overstate what they could not explain. Their restraint gives the stories a peculiar gravity, not certainty, but sincerity. At the same time, institutions rely on a different kind of memory. They preserve transcripts, reports, summaries, and official conclusions. These records can stabilize history, but they can also flatten it. A strange event becomes a line item. A line item becomes a classification. A classification becomes closure. The personal memory remains alive and unresolved, while the institutional memory moves on. Between those two forms of remembering, the inward and the official, an uneasy gap remains. Perhaps that gap is where many of these mysteries truly live. Not in proof, not in rumor, but in the space between what happened, what was recorded, and what a human being can never quite forget. And maybe that is why these stories stay with us. They remind us that truth is not always a fixed point. Sometimes it is the distance between two memories, both sincere, neither complete. What if the deepest unease in these stories comes from how ordinary the witnesses were meant to seem? Astronauts were presented to the public as the highest expression of discipline. Calm under pressure, mathematically precise, emotionally contained. They were not mythic seers. They were professionals. That image mattered because entire nations invested symbolic hope in it. To send a person into space was to send a model of rational humanity. Rational. So when that model hinted at something it could not fully explain, the disturbance spread far beyond one individual report. This is why credibility became its own kind of drama. A poet can describe a vision and be praised for sensitivity. A pilot describes one and the room changes temperature. Suddenly, every word is weighed not for beauty, but for risk. Will it undermine confidence? Invite ridicule? Blur the line between science and speculation? The witness knows this before he speaks. He understands that one poorly framed sentence can follow him longer than a successful mission. And yet, some continue to speak, carefully, incompletely, often with visible reluctance. Their testimony rarely sounded triumphant. It sounded burdened. They did not present themselves as possessors of secret wisdom. More often, they seemed like people who had glimpsed something that did not fit the life they were trained to lead. That tension gives these stories a quiet emotional force. The frontier did not only test hardware, it tested identity. To be an astronaut is to be trusted with what the rest of humanity cannot personally verify. Very few people will ever see the Earth from orbit or watch darkness sweep across the curvature of the planet in absolute silence. We rely on those who went for us, but reliance creates pressure. The witness becomes both observer and representative, carrying private astonishment inside a public role built on composure. Perhaps that is why the most haunting element in these accounts is not the object, the light, or the missing explanation. It is the face of a credible person trying to remain credible while speaking about something that resists the world's available categories. In that moment, we are not only hearing a mystery, we are watching a human being negotiate the cost of honesty in a culture that prefers certainty. What if the real threshold was never the edge of Earth's atmosphere, but the edge of our willingness to live without final answers? By the later decades of the space age, the question of unexplained encounters had grown larger than any single mission. It moved through memoirs, interviews, declassified fragments, in the slow afterlife of public fascination. The stories no longer belonged only to astronauts. They belonged to all of us, because they touched something older than spaceflight itself, the tension between what we know and what we can bear, not knowing. Science is often misunderstood as a machine for certainty. In truth, its noblest form begins with disciplined doubt. It asks us to look closely, measure carefully, and resist the seduction of premature conclusions. But that discipline can feel emotionally unsatisfying. Human beings want closure. We want the object identified, the archive completed, the witness either confirmed or corrected. Mystery unsettles us because it leaves our imagination awake long after the evidence has gone quiet. Perhaps that is why these stories continue to resonate. They unfold at the meeting point of two powerful instincts. One is the scientific instinct to explain. The other is the human instinct to wonder. Neither is wrong. In fact, they need each other. Wonder without rigor drifts into fantasy. Rigor without wonder risks becoming blind to the very questions that make discovery possible. Astronauts, in this sense, became symbols of a larger human condition. They traveled farther than most, but they returned with a burden familiar to anyone who has lived long enough to encounter loss, beauty, or sudden awe. Some experiences can be described with precision. Others remain partly untranslatable. We circle them for years, offering better words, better tools, better frameworks. And still, something escapes. Maybe that escape is not a failure of understanding, but a measure of reality's depth. The universe does not owe us simplicity. It offers glimpses, patterns, interruptions, just enough to draw us forward. And so the question remains open, not because truth is absent, but because truth is sometimes larger than our current language for holding it. What if, in the end, the greatest secret space reveals is not about visitors or hidden machines, but about ourselves? After all the missions, all the briefings, all the disputed images and hesitant recollections, one fact remains untouched. The people who left Earth did not come back unchanged. Even when they spoke only of science, one could hear a quieter transformation underneath. The planet looked smaller, borders looked thinner, certainty itself looked more fragile. Many astronauts described a profound shift in perspective after seeing Earth from above. The experience has often been called the overview effect, but the phrase is almost too tidy for what it suggests. To witness the world as a bright, vulnerable sphere hanging in blackness is to feel both distance and intimacy at once. Home becomes visible in its entirety, and strangely harder to explain. In that altered frame, perhaps it is not surprising that other assumptions begin to loosen as well. A person who has seen continents drift silently beneath a window may no longer divide reality as neatly as before. The categories of ordinary life, known and unknown, practical and poetic, measurable and felt, can begin to overlap. This does not mean every mystery points to an extraordinary external cause. It means that space has a way of enlarging the mind's sense of what counts as a serious question. It invites humility, and humility is often mistaken for uncertainty when in fact it is a deeper form of intelligence. So perhaps the stories that endure are not really about proving what was seen. Perhaps they survive because they preserve a rare human posture. Openness without surrender, curiosity without fanaticism, awe without illusion. In a culture that constantly demands immediate conclusions, these witnesses offer something more difficult and more valuable. They show us how to stand before the unresolved without turning away. And that may be the hidden inheritance of the space age. Not answers sealed in vaults, but a more honest relationship with mystery itself. The farther we travel into the universe, the more clearly we may discover that the unknown is not an obstacle to understanding. It is the condition that makes understanding worth pursuing at all. So where does that leave us? After all the lights beside capsules, the missing certainty in photographs, the guarded debriefings, the memories that sharpened instead of fading, it leaves us where the most enduring human stories always do, not at the end of a mystery, but at the threshold of a larger one. Space promised answers. In many ways, it delivered. It taught us how stars are born, how fragile atmospheres can be, how a species tied to one world might one day cross into others. But alongside those measurable victories came something less easy to chart: the realization that every frontier expands not only knowledge, but also the boundaries of what we do not yet understand. The astronauts and cosmonauts in this story were not prophets. They were not perfect witnesses either. They were human beings placed in conditions so unfamiliar that even ordinary perception could become extraordinary. That matters. It reminds us to be careful, to resist both gullibility and contempt. Some accounts may someday yield simple explanations. Others may remain permanently unresolved, not because they are false, but because evidence is incomplete and memory is mortal. Yet unresolved does not mean meaningless. These stories endure because they illuminate something essential about the human condition. We are creatures who measure and imagine at the same time. We build instruments, and we also build narratives to carry what the instruments cannot fully settle. We want truth, but often what we receive first is ambiguity. Then comes the harder task, to live responsibly in its presence. Perhaps that is the final gift of these long, echoing accounts from orbit and beyond. They ask us to become more mature in our curiosity, to admit that wonder is not the enemy of reason, to understand that skepticism, at its best, is not a wall against mystery, but a discipline for approaching it honestly. And to remember that every time a human being looks out into the dark and tries to describe what cannot quite be named, they are participating in an ancient act of courage. The universe may keep some of its silence. Memory may never surrender every hidden room. But the search itself, the reaching, the questioning, the effort to speak carefully about what lies beyond certainty, may be the most human truth of all. In the end, perhaps what space gives back to us is not a final answer, but a better question: how should we live, knowing that reality is always wider than the story we have told so far?